Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. You're in for a treat today. It's my great honor as the Dean of the Said Business School to welcome you to today's panel event with the distinguished luminary in economics, Professor Darren Acemoglu, who is here with us as the new Sanjaya Lall Professor of Business and Development. This prestigious chair is generously endowed to honor the intellectual contributions of the late Professor Sanjaya Lall, one of the world's preeminent development economists. Sanjay grew up in India, but spent 40 years of his distinguished career researching and lecturing here at the University of Oxford from 1965 till 2005. Sanjay's much respected research focused on the impact of foreign direct investment in developing countries, the economics of multinational corporations, and the development of technological capability and industrial competitiveness. In addition to his academic work, he provided respected policy advice and valued guidance to governments across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and also to a wide range of international organizations from the World Bank to UNIDO. He also bridged the gap between academia and practice and was equally comfortable in both management boardrooms and in lecture halls. Now, part of the legacy of Sanjay's work here at Oxford is the creation of this visiting professorship established in 2011 and made possible through the very generous support of the Sanjaya Lall Memorial Fund, set up by Sanjay's wife, Rani. And we're very fortunate to have Rani here with us. Rani, thank you so much. And Ranjit, the son of Sanjay, who was professor of economics at Oxford. Thanks to them, Darren now joins a community and a very select group of economists. This is one of the most prestigious visiting positions in economics and has hosted several winners of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics, including Professors Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, and Abhijit Banerjee, as well as other leading economists such as Avinash Dixit, Danny Roderick, and Raj Shetty. In today's panel talk, The Future of Work in the Age of AI, Darren will consider the best use of artificial intelligence technologies to create meaningful and well-paying jobs in the future, and explore the opportunities to create a pro-worker, pro-human AI. You'll be hearing more on this and the details of our other esteemed panelists from the Warden of All Souls College, Sir John Vickers, shortly. Darren's awards, fellowships, published books, and influential research papers are impressive, many and varied. He advocates for AI technologies that not only enhance productivity, but also prioritize human welfare and job creation. His forward-thinking proposals emphasize developing AI systems that are beneficial for humans, promote broader economic equality, and address challenges of increased workplace surveillance and inequality. He very much embodies the Sanjaya Lall Visiting Professorship spirit of Oxford, a spirit of inquiry, rigor, and transformative impact. His scholarly analysis of how political and economic institutions impact development mirrors the intellectual pursuits and legacy of Sanjay, whose work explores these essential themes. We look forward to the start of what promises to be an enlightening tenure with Darren and his visionary work that will enrich both life at our school and across the wider university. It is our privilege to support him, learn from his insights, and collaborate in advancing a collective understanding, growth, and impact on the world. Welcome, Darren, to Oxford University. Now, with great pleasure, I hand you over to Sir John, who will be introducing our panelists and has more details of today's exciting panel discussion. Sir John.
Thank you very much indeed. So, as you heard, I'm John Vickers, Warden of All Souls. I'm also an economist, and I chair the Board of Electors to the Sanjaya Lall Visiting Professorship. I'd like to begin by echoing and underlining the thanks to the Memorial Fund, and also to pay tribute to Sanjaya, who I remember not only as an absolutely wonderful economist, but also the most terrific colleague to have. So we're very grateful to the trustees of the Memorial Fund, also to St John's College, which is the host college for the professorship, and whose president, Sue Black, is right here. So we're grateful to you. Now, I need to confess that I woke up rather late to AI, but I remember the moment very distinctly. It was in the autumn of 2021, and we had as a visiting fellow at my college the remarkable James Manyika, and he was editing a special issue of Daedalus. That's the journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And I think, Helen, you appeared in that special issue. And we got talking over dinner about these things called large language models, which I knew approximately zero about beforehand. And he was explaining how you feed general questions in and you get these very interesting answers. And I said, well, that's fascinating, because 2 weeks ago in the college, we had the annual examination fellowship competition. And a component of that are a couple of question papers with very general questions. So the obvious idea was, let's see how James's models fared on the college exam questions. So this duly happened, and a few days later he gave a talk with the results, which are published actually in an annex in this edition of Daedalus. And they were by no means perfect, but my goodness, and I think others were just shocked at how remarkable even then this technology was becoming. And that was 2.5 years ago, and in that time, of course, the advances and the awareness and the economic and financial significance of this technology has become ever more evident in this incredibly fast-moving scene. So we've got the most amazing topic for this terrific panel that we have this evening. I will introduce Chris and Helen after Daron has spoken, and there will be time for general Q&A towards the end, I very much hope. But let me add a few more words about Daron, who is the Sanjaya Lall Visiting Professor. So Daron, I think we should be proud in this country that his university education was at York and the LSE, so in that sense it's welcome back. But his career has been mainly very much so at MIT, where he is an institute professor. Now, it is true to say that he's an economist of the most formidable range and power, but it's also a great understatement, because he is so much more than that. He's a social scientist who works in political economy, so goes into political science, and indeed into history as well, which is very, very evident from his enormous corpus of work. There are 6 books, including most famously with James Robinson and Simon Johnson, articles in all the top journals, and he is prodigiously cited. In fact, if ever you have an academic colleague who you think needs a little bit more humility, my suggestion is you point them to Google Scholar, the citation engine, and type in Acemoglu, and they will be cured. So, so we have the most wonderful lecturer. I'm going to give the floor to Daron in just a moment. I think, Daron, you'll speak for half an hour, something like that, and then we'll go to the other panelists and then back to the room. But let us, again, thank you very much indeed, Daron, for coming to be the Sanjaya Lall Visiting Professor, and we look forward enormously to hearing you.
lost my voice yesterday, so I'll get some water first. But as I do that, let me say it's a true pleasure to be here, and thank you to Sumitra and John for this wonderful introduction. So many nice words. I think it could only be downhill from here, but hopefully not too much. So it's a true honor to be the Sanjaya Lall Visiting Professor for 2024, and it's a true honor to be here with all of you. And I would like to share some of my thoughts on the future of work and society in the age of AI. I don't think I need to give a long introduction to this question, because the transformative changes we are seeing, the impressive changes we are seeing, are of course extremely well known. And the amount of resources and the amount of computational power and investment going into these models is also truly striking. The Apollo control system, the computers that sent the people to the moon for the first time, were doing computations of the order of about 1,500 flops per second. So the current models are trained about 1 trillion more computational power as these. So we are all in AI, and the question is what we're going to get out of it. My argument is that there is a path, a narrow path ahead of using these somewhat impressive and somewhat hopeful technologies in a way that would be good for workers and good for society. But it's a very narrow path and a different one from the one we're pursuing right now. And the beginning of this is that I think the true promise of generative AI models is flexible, intelligent, and easily usable tools for humans. The irony of today is that we have more abundant information than any time in history. Just think of the internet. But the amount of useful information is extremely scarce. If you try to get reliable information about any particular topic, especially to help you in a series of problem-solving tasks, whether you're a creative artist, you're an academic, you're a journalist, or an electrician or a plumber, I think that useful information is extremely scarce. So the true promise of generative AI and AI more generally is to provide that type of information to human decision makers. However, I will argue that that's not where we're heading. That's not where we're heading for several reasons, which I'm going to summarize in terms of 4 roadblocks, which I'm going to call excessive automation, loss of human informational diversity, human AI misalignment, and monopolized control of information. But also I will argue that all 4 of these roadblocks are rooted not just in the business sector's incentives in how they use and develop AI technologies, but also in the vision or ideology of the tech sector that is perhaps, or at least my argument, is pushing us in the wrong direction. So in particular, ever since the beginning of the computer age, I think you can see 2 very different, in some sense, opposed visions. One of them that goes back to this very, very inspiring, very, very brilliant mathematician that, whom you all know, of course, Alan Turing, emphasized from the very beginning, for reasons related to both Alan Turing's brilliant mathematical work on computation, but also his philosophical sort of approach, autonomous machine intelligence, meaning computers reaching human-like capabilities and also acting autonomously, meaning in a way that wasn't completely controlled by humans. This became a very inspiring vision for many people, and it also very much shaped the early phases of the AI revolution. So for example, the second picture I have there is from the Dartmouth conference where the field of AI was christened, and the characters there are also very famous mathematicians, computer scientists, social psychologists, and an economist, actually, Herbert Simon. And they very much followed Turing's vision, hook, line, and sinker. In fact, they were very optimistic that computers, AI systems, would soon reach human-like capabilities and start acting like humans in the near future. Of course, that didn't come to pass, but the aspiration of autonomous machine intelligence remained. The second vision, though in some ways not completely opposed to it, is in many ways very, very different. And if you're going to find one person to see as its beginning, I would put that person there, Norbert Wiener, who was an MIT mathematician and engineer. And around the same time as Alan Turing was writing, in '49 actually, Norbert Wiener started talking about what robots and automation, way before any actual robots were actually introduced, would do to workers and to human society, and he wasn't very optimistic. And instead, he outlined a very different type of approach to human-machine interactions, and he started developing mathematical models. But it wasn't just people like Norbert Wiener who were at the philosophical or mathematical level. A number of people throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s actually turned this into a much more workable vision. And in fact, many of the things that we depend on today, we take for granted. For example, the computer mouse, the menu-driven computer interfaces, hyperlinks, hypertext, all came out of this very different vision, which in my book with Simon Johnson we call machine usefulness to contrast with machine intelligence. So from the beginning, this was the idea that machines should be useful to humans, should be aligned with humans and expand human capabilities. So for example, Douglas Engelbart, whose picture I don't have, but I have his first mouse from 1968, who thought of this as human machine complementarity. J.C.R. Licklider, who applied these ideas both in terms of guiding younger researchers to do the same, and also in terms of developing the algorithms, the procedures for ARPANET and then the internet, and called this human-machine symbiosis, were very much in this camp. But for reasons that we can trace both to financial incentives and to perhaps the catchiness of the machine intelligence vision, over time, especially after the PC revolution, this machine usefulness agenda became overshadowed in the tech sector. The problem is that I think the evidence suggests the machine usefulness agenda is much more productive, both in terms of generating a direction for research that's going to be good for a variety of societal outcomes, and for supporting other social goods, including low inequality, more democratic participation, and so on, for reasons I'm going to try to exploit. On the other hand, the machine intelligence agenda easily leads itself to more and more automation, because if machines are reaching these human-like capabilities, why not let them take over more and more human tasks? It leads to more permissive approaches to collecting data and using data in order to guide humans, sometimes manipulate humans. So I believe and will argue that the current state of the tech industry and the current ecosystem around tech in the business world, especially in the United States, but around the world, cannot be understood without this autonomous machine intelligence vision. But what the leaders or luminaries of the alternative machine usefulness idea foresaw or tried to argue 60 years ago actually is much more of a reality today. So when J.C.R. Licklider wrote in the 1960s, he talked of the hope is that human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly. What he meant by that is not, of course, putting computer chips in people's brains, but computers providing useful information to humans. That wasn't really feasible. It was feasible only in limited ways in the 1960s. But I think with the generative AI advances, it is. Is this, first of all, the right vision? Well, I will try to explain why, especially via these roadblocks. But another question you could ask from the other side, you could say, are you being too optimistic? Perhaps it is not even feasible to do this machine usefulness, and generative AI is going to do what it's going to do, but it will never help humans. Well, we should worry about all of these things, but There are already some studies that show in a proof of concept way that if generative AI is used to provide information to humans and work with them, even though its current architecture is not well designed for that, it actually sort of leads to better outcomes. So a series of studies, for example, one by Peng et al. In the context of GitHub Copilot, about which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a second, by two PhD students of mine and others at MIT, Shiket Noy and Whitney Zhang, for simple writing tasks, and by the most ambitious one, because it's in a real-world context, from a customer service help firm by Eric Brynjolfsson, Danielle Lee, and Lindsay Raymond, all show this in various different ways. In all cases, what you find is that if given access to generative AI tools in some sort of a randomized controlled trial manner, or approximating it thereof, workers benefit because they can either get more useful information or they can leave some of the most routine parts of their tasks to these tools and then specialize in other parts. And that leads to faster completion of tasks. But most interestingly, it also precisely helps the lower expertise, lower skilled workers. So in particular, for example, this is from the Noy-Zhang paper, you see that the best performing workers don't get much of an improvement, but it's the lower performing workers that are improving. So this is the performance curve is tilting up. So that is exactly the telltale sign that this is providing useful help to workers to perform the tasks, in particular problem-solving like tasks that they were doing. But why do I think this is just not likely to be what we see in the years to come? Because I think there are both historical, theoretical, and empirical reasons to see a very different path. And these different paths, I think, is characterized by these 4 roadblocks that I have listed already. I'm listing them again, and I'll go through each one of them in some detail now. By excessive automation, what I mean is that we overdo the automation. Of course, things are going to be automated. We don't want to go back to a time when people use shovels rather than cranes and diggers. But if we go too much into automation and start taking tasks over from humans without creating new competencies, new information, new tasks for them, this is going to be both not so good for productivity, for reasons I'll explain, and also pretty bad for inequality. Let me start with that, and I'll come to the others later. Well, this is not a new concern. In fact, the US labor market has experienced something that is completely unique in recent history, at least history for which we can sort of refer to as post-industrial revolution history, where economic growth has gone hand in hand with a completely non-shared pattern of prosperity. And I'm trying to illustrate that, this thing that happens in the age of digital machines, in this chart where I'm showing the evolution of the real wages of 10 demographic groups distinguished by gender and education. In terms of education, it goes all the way from workers who have a postgraduate degree in dark blue, all the way down in orange to workers who don't have a high school degree. And what you see is that starting in 1963, where I'm starting this and normalizing everything to 0, the first 15 years or so were a period of shared prosperity. In fact, the same is true if you go before 63 to 1949 using different data sets. And you see a very striking pattern that all of these curves are on top of each other, which means that real wages were growing essentially at the same rate for all these 10 demographic groups. In fact, they were growing very, very rapidly, about 2.5 percentage points in inflation-adjusted terms. So if you work in a job and your wages increase 2.5% a year, for 30 years you've more than doubled your income. So this is really a striking rate of income growth, and this was the period in which where people were really benefited from having access to work. But from around 1980, roughly the computer age, we see a very different pattern. Not only these curves are going in very different directions, showing a striking increase in inequality, but more jarringly, you see that low education groups, the high school dropouts in orange, high school graduates in green, and workers with associate degrees in black, are actually experiencing real declines in their real earnings. of course, such a striking change that went on for almost 40 years of this expanding inequality has multiple causes. But in my work, especially work I have done with Pascual Restrepo, I have argued that it is centrally about automation. So it's how we have used these digital capabilities has to be a very, very, very important part of this explanation. And that's not always the one factor that's emphasized. So let me try to make that case for it in a very summary form by showing you this second chart. So what I do here is that I'm looking at more detailed demographic groups, not just education and gender, but also age, ethnicity, and so on. And so there are 500 dots there. The color coding, again, gives you the education of the relevant demographic group. Instead of looking at the evolution of wages, I'm zeroing in on the cumulative changes in real wages from 1980 to 2016, 2017. So the vertical axis is that cumulative wage increase. So you see the zero line there. So many of these dots are below the zero. So this confirms that many demographic groups, about half of the population, has actually lost out while the economy was growing fairly rapidly. But most importantly, the horizontal axis now is a measure of automation experienced by each demographic group. It's essentially the fraction of tasks that that demographic group used to perform in 1980 that have since been automated. So a number like 20% here means that for these low education groups, very large groups by the size of the circle, about 20% of what they used to do in 1980 is no longer available because machines, software, robotics, dedicated machinery have taken them over. And you see a very strong relationship, and most importantly, you see that almost all of the variation below zero I'm sorry is explained by automation. Very interestingly, this automation is also going hand in hand with relatively little productivity benefits. So when you look at sectors, firms, or parts of the economy that are investing more on automation and more digital computers, except of the tech industry itself, you don't see much of a productivity increase. And in fact, this is going to relate to what I'm going to talk about next, which is that when you overdo automation, what you're doing is you're taking away tasks from humans that were pretty good at what they were doing. So you're not going to get a big productivity boost out of that. Now, the other thing you may worry about is that this is perhaps some unique period, and if my argument here depends on this time is different, you may want to be more suspicious of it. But actually, this sort of tensions that I'm talking about, automation and who benefits from automation, how you control automation, are actually very much things you see in history. And that's the reason why, in fact, I wrote the book with Simon Johnson on Power and Progress, to sort of look at the historical evolution of both how technology is used, who benefits from it, and the debates around it. And for example, when you hear the argument from some public intellectuals and especially people in the tech industry that there is nothing to worry about because in the past we've went through similar things and we all turned out to be fine, well, don't believe that. History actually tells a very different story. History tells a story in which, for about 80 years, the first phases of the Industrial Revolution did not show anything like shared prosperity, and it actually generated a pattern very much like the one I showed in the US. The early phases of the British Industrial Revolution, which were completely transformative and revolutionary for their time, did not generate shared prosperity. So a few entrepreneurs, capital owners benefited hugely, but for example, weavers, so as much as 50% decline in their real wages and huge rates of unemployment, and also much, much higher rates of mortality, much lower life expectancy, much worse working conditions, and so on. Today, we look back at that age and say, okay, we're so fortunate to be children of the Industrial Revolution. That's true. We will live much more comfortable, healthier, prosperous lives, but that's because things really changed after the second half of, around the second half of the 19th century, the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, but there was nothing automatic about that. That was the outcome of a really transformative change in terms of political institutions, direction of technology, and labor markets. So fundamental political reform, Britain became a democratic or quasi-democratic society starting from around the 1820s, 1830s, when a very small fraction of the population had any political voice. Trade unions, which were very heavily prosecuted, became legal in the last quarter of the century, and technology got redirected away from pure automation towards increasing the capabilities of a broader set of workers. You may also wonder whether what I showed you, which is mostly pre-AI technology, also applies for AI, and the answer is, yeah, I think there is some suggestive evidence that it does. For example, in a paper that is not about generative AI, so it's pre-generative AI technologies that I wrote with David Otter, Joe Hazel, and Pasquale Restrepo, we showed that AI technologies were also adopted almost predominantly for automation and not much evidence of huge productivity gains. Rather, you get things like this, self-checkout kiosks that don't work so well. That's a sign of excessive automation because you're doing it too soon and you're replacing workers too much. No wonder that you're not going to get the productivity benefits. But you can have better AI. What is better AI? Better AI is exactly repeating what we learned from periods in which wages grew. During periods in which wages grew were those in which technological change was not blocked, technological change was not absent. But technological change took a form that's very different than just pure automation. It generated new tasks and new competencies for workers. I can tell that story with the second phase of the British Industrial Revolution, which I talked about, but an even sharper illustration is the auto industry in the US in the early decades of the 20th century. Henry Ford, a leader on this, was very keen on automation. He was the one who introduced interchangeable part systems the first time in large scale in manufacturing, introduced electrical power, decentralized electrical power. He wanted to use machines, but Henry Ford was also a leader in introducing new tasks. He made the machines work with workers performing more technical, more expert tasks, and also supported with a whole slew of engineering white-collar tasks in the back offices and in the planning stages to increase efficiency and enable mass production. So you see here cars, new machinery, but working critically with human workers. And the same is true in other periods as well. New tasks for workers, meaning machines being useful to workers is key, in fact, not just for more equal outcomes, but I would argue, and I think the evidence is broadly supportive, it's really key for productivity growth as well. But if we are going to use machines in this way, especially AI in this way, as I've already mentioned, information provision is key. AI as an informational tool that makes flexible, real-time, reliable, context-dependent information available to problem solvers is critical both for workers to become better problem solvers and to perform a broader set of more complex tasks. So how are we going to use the information AI provides to us, and what type of information the current architecture of AI can provide to us? Unfortunately, I think the news is not good. I think the three next roadblocks are about that. The way that AI is currently working and why it's not going to provide and it's not likely to provide the right type of information. The first one is loss of informational diversity. Human ingenuity is all about collective learning. We have something that most other species don't have. In fact, I think no other species even approaches it, which is we discover new things and we share them in groups. So that means experimentation, diversity is key to human learning, and then our ability to share it. So AI has that ability to share it. But if in the process of sharing that, you also kill informational diversity, that's going to be really costly for further learning. In particular, any information provision tool has that risk. You were going left, it tells you to go right. Well, if everybody follows it and everybody goes right, there goes informational diversity, there goes experimentation. There goes all the learning that you could have done by some people actually taking a different route. Is this a hypothetical, theoretical concern? No, even with much more primitive technologies, we have experienced this. For example, one wonderful technology, I have nothing against it, nothing negative to say, because I depend on it, GPS. and many occupations today depend on it. So GPS-enabled navigation systems are super, super useful. But the evidence is that they actually created exactly this problem, that when you introduce GPS, many people start following the recommendation, and it creates bottlenecks, especially in small roads where the latency, the ability to carry traffic is limited. So here is, for example, London, minor roads, GPS introduces, traffic congestions actually increase, only a small effect on the major roads. So you really have to manage this informational diversity and experimentation part, really important. It becomes particularly salient, I think, if you really think about what GPT-like machines like ChatGPT are doing. So, in fact, I mentioned the Peng et al. Paper earlier about GitHub Copilot helping computer programmers write simple subroutines in things like HTML or JavaScript or Python. So how come GPT, GPT-3, GPT-4, ChatGPT know how to do subroutines? Well, a large part of the answer is a website called Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow, there's a math version, there's a computer science version, is not the apex, but is a very brilliant illustration of what I said, the collective learning of humans, which is that if you are a programmer and you're having a problem, you post a question on Stack Overflow, and other experts either know the answer or have some ideas, they make suggestions, or they go and explore. In Math Overflow, sometimes people spend days in order to answer your questions. So Stack Overflow is how humans actually shared and actually furthered their understanding of computer programming. It was also a great data set for ChatGPT because it's extremely well curated, so so OpenAI ransacked it and took all that information. They didn't ask permission. So what happens now to Stack Overflow after ChatGPT is released? That's the date. This is traffic on Stack Overflow. It completely collapses. Now nobody uses it because they can get it from ChatGPT. They're all following what ChatGPT says, so all of that human information exchange completely disappears. And you know that this is the effect of ChatGPT because the math overflow is constant. The Russian and the Chinese, where ChatGPT was banned, is constant. So it's really a very clear illustration, as this very nice paper by a number of computer scientists show. So this issue is major. But it's actually complemented by what I called human-AI misalignment. Some of you may have heard of the alignment problem where, super intelligent machines are going to have unaligned, misaligned incentives with humanity. That's not what I'm talking about. I think that's completely a sideshow that's I wouldn't worry about. I don't think super intelligent machines are around the corner. But there is a much more mundane, boring kind of misalignment that's very important. Again, let's go back to our example. I was going left, and in information provision tools, ChatGPT or some other large language model tells me to go right. At that point, I can either ignore it, I can continue to go left, well then that's not super useful. I can go right, completely buy what it's saying. I have lost my human agency, and this diversity issues have become multiplied, as I've just explained. Or there is something better. I can take that recommendation and combine it with my own expertise, with my own understanding, with my own context-specific details. But to be able to do that, I need to understand why this recommendation is telling me to go right. It requires something from me, something from the machine. That's the alignment. The machine needs to have a clarity of what type of information is the basis of its recommendation, and I need to understand, I need to have the training or the judgment to evaluate it and process that information. Well, right now we don't have any of that. In fact, I don't think it's possible because the non-transparency of the current architecture is going to make that impossible. Again, this is not a hypothetical problem. In two settings, predictive policing and doctors, we see evidence of this already. For example, let me just mention briefly work by my colleagues Nikhil Agrawal, Tobias Soltz, and co-authors that look at physicians, doctors, getting AI-based recommendation, and they get exactly this misalignment, which is that doctors don't know why the AI is making this recommendation. As a result, they get a conformity bias. Whatever AI is saying that meets their own predisposition, they overweight that, They don't know how to combine it with their information, and they don't get any benefit from the AI systems. And the final one is control of information. Information can never be separated from who controls it. This is what the essence of Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, and why it wasn't such a wonderful tool as Jeremy Bentham thought it was. Because it wasn't just providing useful information for people, it was providing useful information to a very specific group of people who wanted to control workers, who wanted to control inmates, who wanted to control schools. Today, information is even more of a weapon in politics, even more of a weapon in which type of system you're going to support, and who you're going to give the power to guide your actions. What we have seen in social media, I think, is very much the tip of the iceberg, meaning that the possibility that centralized control of information can be used in manipulative ways to benefit some people, either a regime, be it the Chinese Communist Party or some other authoritarian regime, or some large companies who have a model for monetizing that data, or some small actors who are trying to create havoc, whatever it is, but that control of information is critical. And the concern is that the current architecture and structure of the AI models and the incentives in the tech industry, I think, are going to make this a real danger, not just to the useful deployment of that information in the production process, but to democracy and to social relations as well. Again, I think now, better than a couple of years ago, the mental health consequences, misinformation consequences, but perhaps even broader dysfunctional consequences of social media ecosystems are being understood. And I think the danger, as we move more and more into AI-based, more powerful algorithmic decisions that guide our communication, is something that, again, somebody anticipated more than 60 years ago, this time Hannah Arendt, when she was talking of totalitarianism, when she says, if everybody lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. And that lack of shared understanding, of course, means democracy becomes impossible. Now, much of my talk focused on the US, because these concerns are easiest to understand in the US, but the issues are similar in the industrialized world. But also critical is what is going on in the developing world, where, leaving out China, Europe, and the United States, more than 5 billion people are going to be affected by AI. First of all, the global division of labor is going to change. Secondly, many of these technologies are going to start being used. But right now, AI is something done to these 5 billion people in which they have no voice. And I think one of the consequences, and Noam is here, and he has written on this. This is not from Noam, but from an Australian Strategic Policy Institute report. These are all the places that have imported Chinese surveillance technology. So the technologies that are developed in the hubs of AI, the US, China, partly Europe, are going to get spread in the rest of the world, and any distortions that happens in the United States is going to be multiplied in the developing world, because even the modicum of regulations and the barriers against their use is not going to be present. Good news, I think an alternative path is possible, as I've tried to articulate. The bad news is that that's not where we're going, and I don't think there are any self-correcting mechanisms. One self-correcting mechanism would be that science has an arc that bends towards progress. Well, I don't believe it does. I think science responds to incentives as much as anything else. But even more so, even if science autonomously did so, the current state of science in this field has lost all independence. So here is AI research. The green is academic research. In 2000, most of research was academic. Of course, some of it was funded indirectly by businesses. But today, this is the green. This is the industry research. This is academic industry collaborations. So academia is very much aligned with the industry priorities. So unless industry priorities change, nothing will change. So the good news, therefore, is that it is possible to change industry priorities, and by that I mean both the tech industry in the development and the rest of the business sector in how they use AI. But that won't be easy, so I will end by leaving this slide rather than going through it, because I don't want to overstay my welcome. But essentially, fundamental reform that's both political and regulatory and fiscal, that affects simultaneously how AI is used by the business world, how the tech industry functions and what it targets, and the overall regulatory environment, including the democratic voice in how the direction of research is chosen. In sum, I don't think it is possible to achieve a better outcome, which this narrow path, without some amount of democratic control, because the current incentives are not in the right direction. Thank you.
Daron, thank you very, very much indeed. Now, our first panelist to comment is Chris Pissarides. I'll keep the introductions brief. I can say very simply that Chris is an absolutely great economist. That was recognized in 2010 when he received Nobel Prize in Economics, along with Peter Diamond and Dale Mortensen. And the citation for that was for their analysis of markets with search frictions, which might sound very technical and niche. In fact, it is technical, but it's the opposite of niche, because such markets are everywhere, not least labor markets, which Daron has talked about. And Chris has made absolutely profound contributions to that area. And Chris, we look forward very much to your comments on our topic today. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here talking about AI and jobs, especially following our former student, Daron, from the London School of Economics, I might remind you. The technology and jobs have occupied me for at least 35 years. I'm trying to think. It's very easy to identify it because it coincides with my meeting with Dale Mortensen in the beginning of our collaboration, when I was more, I guess, influenced more by British and European economics, thinking that the world was driven by Keynesian shocks. And then one day when I met my late friend Dale, he said to me, we should put technology shocks in our models. And I said to him, why? He said, oh, because some of us believe that jobs change in response to technology jobs. And we started, and I never looked back since then. And the problem that I have, in fact, with technology and the jobs is that now technology is changing so fast that by the time we understand one type of technology and what impact it has on jobs, then another type of technology comes along. And you need to learn new things, so it's a good topic for lifelong learning. Now, when it comes to AI, we are currently at the Institute for the Future of Work in London, engaged on a 3-year project funded by the Nuffield Foundation, where we're looking at the impact of technology, especially AI. I mean, what other technology can there be? Mainly focusing on workers' well-being, also on the future of work and jobs that Daron talked. So my comments will be more directed to the very final, not the final but one slide that Daron showed, which was about workers' responses to AI and how can we make sure that AI is implemented in a way that improves worker well-being. Now, at the risk of oversimplification, I'd say that Daron's main theme is that AI can be developed to complement labor, but it's currently being developed as an alternative to labor. He hasn't reacted badly, so I think I might be on the right lines. Now, it has been one of our themes in the research that we're doing with AI in London, that we have a lot of choice how to develop it, much more than we have ever had with past technologies. So we should be thankful really to Daron, not only for what he said today, but his work at MIT with his students, co-authors, David Otto, Eric Pelthausen when he was there, I guess. It's been extremely influential both on us and everyone else working on AI and jobs. But what it's sort of, when I say we should be thankful, what we emphasize today as well is that the direction that AI is taking in its early development stages is not the right one, and there are dangers inherent in the practices that we're adopting with respect to AI. Now, AI, of course, is another automation technology, like all the other previous ones since the steam engine, I guess. And inevitably will replace some human tasks, whichever way we develop it. Daron's claim seems to be that we have a choice in the selection of these tasks, and instead of selecting tasks that complement others that remain in human hands, we select ones that automate too much. In other words, they don't leave enough good work in human hands and limit human creativity in other ways that make the outputs that we get more routine and boring. I want to focus on addressing Daron's roadblocks that are the causes of these undesirable outcomes, and discuss two things: how to respond to them, and the second, how to avoid them. Now, looking first at excessive automation. The question is, what's excessive, given that, as I just said, some automation will take place and some replacement of jobs will take place. This question relates to the more general issue of the firm's objectives. Since the 1980s, the most influential view on CEOs has been Friedman's doctrine, which says that if companies want to do most good to society, they should maximize shareholder value. Since automation increases speed and efficiency, by automating everything that can be automated, productivity increases. We haven't seen it yet, but many people expect to see it. I don't think we're going to see very much, actually, but let's take the majority view for now. Profit increases, and society is better off. That's the kind of application of Friedman's doctrine to AI. But as many people pointed out, the Friedman doctrine is simply wrong, even when we ignore externalities, which is the standard objection to profit maximization. Only 2 days ago, Joseph Stiglitz, a previous holder of this fellowship, from what I understand, gave a public lecture at the LSE claiming, very correctly in my view, that there are no circumstances that the doctrine can be right once incomplete information about the market is taken into account. And of course, he is the master of asymmetric information, whereas our frictions are mainly information frictions that are symmetric across the market. Automating to maximize shareholder value could do damage to other social objectives, which in my view are more important than income. A company has many stakeholders, its workers, its customers, and the local community. Maximizing shareholder value could do damage to their well-being. It leads to more inequalities. It could make companies automate tasks that are better done by humans, and it undermines human work by diminishing it. It leaves things to it, not because it's best at doing them, but because machines cannot do them. Automation may even act as a barrier to better worker performance. For example, when workers are trying to complete a task, and bits of that task are done by a machine that they have to go and start and take the results from it. Whereas having objectives beyond shareholder value is generally accepted, at least by people outside the financial sector, and by the Davos crowd, in the 3 days that they are in Davos. They seem to forget that when they leave Davos to go back to their offices. There are difficult issues to address on its implementation. How do you select which tasks to automate and which to leave to human labor? And how do you enforce it on firms? Daron gives an interesting answer to the first question, how you select the tasks with which I agree, but it leaves out parts of a more complete answer that relates also to the first part, actually. He claims that we should use the automation potential of AI to create new tasks. This is a great idea. Use AI to improve the diversity of tasks that humans can do and increase the quality of their output, their productivity, and their creativity. As a consumer of the output, I would love to see something like this taking place. For example, to have a shop assistant use AI to identify the product that I'm looking for very quickly, its properties and its relative advantages over other similar products. As a worker, I also like the idea. Let the computer do the boring stuff of searching and describing products and leave the interesting parts to me. Take now the other half of the question, though. Which of the existing tasks to automate? Here, I would go and review what makes a good job. That's the approach we're following at the Institute for the Future of Work that I mentioned. In worker interviews, the feature that comes out regularly in the top 2 features of a good job is good communication with managers and other colleagues at work. Workers want to be stakeholders in their company. They want to be part of it, communicate frequently in informal situations with the boss and other colleagues, and be allowed to take initiatives and give ideas about the work done in their section of the company. Britain fails badly in this work objective. In fact, when workers are asked how well they're feeling about their work, most rank work satisfaction very low. Apart from life's big unhappy events, like death in the family, the only activity that ranks below work is being sick in bed. And of work-related activities, the one that ranks lowest is seeing the boss. This is the exact opposite of stakeholder capitalism. It's authoritarian capitalism with no transparency. So you're just scared when the boss says, come to see me. You're not expecting a nice coffee and a nice conversation. Having now reached the conclusion that companies should treat their workers and customers as stakeholders and not as cost items, seeking their inputs about which tasks to replace and which new tasks to create, how do you enforce it and how do you monitor it to make sure that you get the opinion of your workers? This seems to be something that needs time, as it needs a cultural change in the way that people treat line managers and subordinates. For example, Americans are better at it than the Brits are. This undoubtedly is related to the background of managers and workers and the mobility between the grades in the 2 countries. Are you from a private, possibly boarding school, and have you got your degree from the Russell Group universities? I was going to say from Oxford and Cambridge, but since then I remember where I was going to give this talk, so I changed it to a broader group. Now you know the secret. Or are you from the local comprehensive? These things still matter in Britain, but of course this doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to change it, starting now. I believe that a lot can be done by companies to improve the situation. And in this, I'm completely in agreement with Colin Mayer's purpose, one of your own, as they say in some football songs. Companies are set up by the law, and the law regulates a lot of their activities related to the way that they treat workers and customers and the information that they make public. A lot of these things are targeted to protect shareholders. More should be done for workers, include good work features beyond the basic ILO labor standards, such as transparency and consultation. AI technology should be able to make this a lot easier than it used to be. Let me now move to the loss of informational diversity, another roadblock of Daron's. Now, Daron gives some good recent examples here. I would like to give one of a big picture nature. New discoveries, although Daron hinted at that actually, but it wasn't in the slides that he sent me to read. And he promised me that he will not change anything. New discoveries derive from human curiosity, and the human mind becomes curious if it's stimulated by observing new things that need explanation. If you ask anyone who's had a big influence on science and a great idea, how did you get to this? They're bound to say just curiosity. Curiosity and luck are the two things that drive big discoveries. Could it be that when we all use the same information sources, expressed in the same way, we will lose this pool of new facts that we come across every day that could stimulate our curiosity? Isaac Newton famously said that he could see further ahead because he stood on broad shoulders. Is AI narrowing the shoulders on which we stand to see ahead? It is probably a bit premature to condemn AI for that, but we should be cautious and not let it take over, because there is a risk. Darren's example, the other example, is congestion in the city, is more plausible at this juncture, as we all seem to have our phones on our windscreens when we drive. It's ironic, however, that Darren criticizes AI, that it might create traffic in areas where we prefer quietness. Another use of AI that I read about in this connection is related to climate change, and it is that it can be used to identify areas of congestion and divert traffic elsewhere to avoid stationary cars emitting carbon fumes. So it seems that when it comes to traffic, AI cannot win. Whichever way it does it, it's a loser. Now, what about monopolized control of information? I will comment on this because it's something that I thought about and worked on recently, wearing a different hat from my IFOW one, and I fear I might be trotting here on what Helen is going to tell you a little bit later, but I won't say too much. We know that information embodied in data is the key to success in the digital age. So those companies that collect information as part of daily activities, like Google, Amazon, Uber, in our countries, in China, Tencent and Alibaba, they have an advantage over other companies and over government. And so we get a data monopoly, which economists know that is not good for society. But another aspect of it can be more positive, and it is the one that Fatih Farah and I have emphasized in a recent book called Quantum Governance. I hope you don't consider this as a commercial break. It's for the benefit of intellectual correctness. And it relates to public policy. Currently, much of public policy is chosen based on demographics. For example, most social transfers are directed to entire demographic groups, such as single parents, the disabled, the over 60s, and others. This is inefficient and the second best to a situation in which policy is more targeted. The use of big data can help in better targeting of policy. If companies treat their data as their proprietary resource, how can government get it and use it? Our argument is that big data has social value because it improves the quality of public services, and there are cost savings too. It makes underprivileged groups better off and reduces inequality. In an ideal world, the owners of the data realize this and pass their data on to government confidentially, so that government can use it to improve social well-being. In a less ideal world, the government finds ways to acquire the data through incentives. For example, reduce a company's tax bill if the company makes available some of its data instead. I think currently we have, companies can give works of art, I think, instead of paying taxes. I think we should follow that example and ask companies to give us their data, to give government their data, and not pay tax. It's such a simple idea. Now, let me finally put on my labor hat again. Since some substitution of human work by AI will take place, how do we deal with the displaced workers? This is the challenge of AI to jobs. It's not the end of work, despite Elon Musk, but the transformation of work. How do workers transition to the new world of work without lengthy interim unemployment and loss of income? In service of worker attitudes, again, the loss of a job and unemployment and following unemployment is much more devastating than income loss. In a better world in which we pay more attention to well-being, lengthy unemployment without general support from the government is damaging to the individual for a long time to come. The answer here is training and adaptation to the new technology. Preparing for this begins at school. The best form of education, in my view, in the digital age, is one that teaches a little bit of everything. STEM up to a certain level, language and good communication skills, social skills such as building up good relations at work and elsewhere, and of course the traditional educational subjects of history, geography, foreign language, and economics. Once that is done, the young people move on to a job of their choice where they acquire more specific knowledge. This continues into later life, so if they are unfortunate enough later to lose their job, they have a set of skills and are ready to embark on new training programs. The need to be ready for training is consistent with the findings of our study of skills in the UK, with the large data set of all jobs advertised online collected by Adzuna, a company that collects all online advertising in the UK, which is about 93% of all jobs being advertised in the UK. New skills come up all the time in job ads, and most of these in recent years are IT connected. The same has been found for the United States, and 10 other European studies by the McKinsey Global Institute in a study soon to be published, which is a successor of this one, which is applied to European countries. And it's based on interviews that they conducted with top managers of large companies. The needs for IT skills, good communication, and critical thinking are growing all the time, and companies are already spending more resources in training new work on those skills. Government has an obligation to provide help in this direction with a suitably structured education curriculum and social support during the transition to new jobs, combined with subsidized training programs for new employees. I think I've run out of my time, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. So now to Helen Margetts, who is a political scientist, but a political scientist who I believe used to be a mathematician. And she is Professor of Society and the Internet here at Oxford, Fellow of Mansfield. And we saw earlier a photo of Alan Turing, which prompted me to say she's also Director of Public Policy Programme at the Alan Turing Institute. So without further ado from me, Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, and it's wonderful to be here and to have listened to that fantastic lecture that Darren gave. And although my role, I believe, is in part a discussant, I'm not going to start disagreeing with what you said. I'm going to violently agree with it. And I'd like to do that by picking up on your point, which I hugely appreciated, this emphasis on pro-human AI and the contrast with what you called machine intelligence and what I've always called the sort of intelligentist view, which has been very dominant in recent years in many quarters. Now, as John said, I'm not an economist. I'm a political scientist, full disclosure, and my focus is on technology and the public sector. I did indeed set up and now direct the public policy programme at the Alan Turing Institute. Now, in that programme, we try to help the public sector make the most of the opportunities of AI while minimising the risks and keeping people safe. And the reason I set that programme up in the very, very early days of the Alan Turing Institute was because most AI is developed by the private sector for the private sector. And I thought it would be good if we had part of the National Institute which was about the public sector, which was about helping the public sector to have a better relationship with the latest generation of technology than it has perhaps had with previous generations of technology. Indeed, when I when I first started teaching public policy at UCL a good few years ago, where we had an extremely international student body, I used to say to my students, if you're interested in government technology disasters, then you have come to the #1 place. You've really, really scored here. So that was the aim of setting up the programme, and I do think it's relevant to this conversation because, after all, around about 17% of the workforce in this country work in the public sector. Even in central government alone, there are around 500,000 civil servants, and around half of those work on service delivery, so kind of directly touching people's lives and using AI for better or for worse. So I want to make 2 points about how that kind of machine intelligence versus pro-human AI discussion is playing out in the public sector from my experience in this programme, and then I'm going to make a point about the information and misinformation that both Darren and Chris made. My first point is about how AI doesn't help policymakers to make decisions. That's a big part of what the public sector does. And I've worked on the relationship between government and technology for a very long time. Indeed, I wrote my PhD about government information technology in the US and the UK back in the 1990s. And I should tell you, in those days, that was a very sad and lonely thing to do. And you certainly can't pack a room if you were talking about that as you can now. And what I learned from kind of that period, and also decades of writing about that topic afterwards, was the kind of this question of a poor relationship between government and technology. Actually, both the US and the UK governments used to be global leaders in kind of innovative administrative computing. In the UK, drawing directly on the expertise generated by Alan Turing at Bletchley Park during the Second World War. So that was back in the 1950s. But since that time, we've seen a sort of progressive degradation of the relationship and a continual focus on doing exactly what Darren said you shouldn't do, which was basically using the technology of the time, not AI at the time, of course, using the technology to automate what people do and then replace the people. And that focus was really driven, I'm not sure it was a sort of deliberate, it wasn't a deliberate machine learning, machine intelligence focus. It was driven by the automatic association that technology would save money. And the way that you were going to save money was by getting rid of people. And of course, that caused a lot of resistance to the idea of technology in government at various periods. But it was particularly powerful during the 1980s, 1990s, and then, right since then, really, for 2 key reasons. One, that the dominant kind of approach to public management at the time, particularly in the UK and the US, was the so-called new public management, a cohort of public sector reform changes, which was all about creating a sort of lean, mean state. It was about economy being the dominant administrative value of government. It was about privatization and outsourcing. And that meshed very well with the idea of technology. Governments weren't very interested in technology, particularly in this country, but they were interested in this idea that you could somehow outsource it and save money with it to shrink the size of the state. So that was one reason why there was a kind of focus on that kind of automation. And the other, of course, were the years that followed austerity. And that's that has dominated right up to the 2000 and 2000s and 20s in many ways. The approach of some governments to using technology and kind of drove this intelligentist vision of technology and was kind of there ready and waiting for AI when it began to be widely used. And the trouble with that is it's not very helpful in decision making. There is one other reason I should mention why it's not very helpful, and that is that governments have no tradition, really, outside perhaps economic policy. In other areas, they have no tradition of using transactional data or any data, really, to drive decision making or inform decision making. If you think, because after all, bureaucracy is based on the idea, is based on the kind of role of information based on what Weber called the files. And if you think of a filing system, it's very useful for finding individual pieces of information, but it doesn't generate usable data for decision making. You make custom-built statistics to be able to understand various aspects of the economy and society, but it doesn't generate transactional data to decide on your social welfare policy and so on. So there isn't really a super good history of technology informing decision-making or helping policymakers to make decisions. And I think the question with AI is how can we do that, and how can we get away from the intelligentist idea of kind of replacing the decision-making and doing the decisions for you, based on the idea that you kind of turbocharge human beings in terms of things they can already do. I think the emphasis really, and this would be the pro-human emphasis, would be on helping people or decision makers to do things that they're really bad at. There's quite a lot of things that humans are really bad at. And one of them is making decisions based on large-scale, heterogeneous sources of data. But AI really could help with that. I'll give you an example of that from the pandemic. So during the pandemic, there was a lot of data, a lot of modeling. Anybody who could halfway claim to be a data scientist was sort of a bit of a rock star. Everybody was looking at models and graphs and R numbers and any number, or even on primetime television. So should have been exciting for people like us and my colleagues at the Turing Institute. But we quickly realized that this kind of data, this kind of modeling was not being used really for decision making. Governments all across the world had to make all sorts of interventions during this period. They had to design follow schemes, they had to design loan schemes, they had to decide whether to lock down on social distancing rules, all kinds of non-pharmaceutical interventions. And they were doing so in a pretty evidence-free sort of way, because they didn't really have the capability to do what AI is good at, or can be good at. I shouldn't say it's automatically good at, if you think about it in that way of helping humans to do things that they are automatically bad at. So you had also these sort of problems that relied both on understanding the spread of the disease, which is what nearly all the models were about, understanding economic behavior, and understanding all sorts of social behavior as well. If you wanted to understand if you were the kind of what would happen if you imposed a complete lockdown. Because if you don't impose a lockdown, it doesn't mean that everything's going to be super cool, because there's this intimate relationship between people's economic behavior and their social behavior. They might still be scared of the spread of the disease. They might still be getting lots of information about the spread of the disease and therefore not going out anyway. And that's going to affect the economy as well. That's just one example, but there's lots of examples where, certainly through the work we've done at the Turing Institute, we believe there could have been the kind of modelling that would have helped policymakers to do that and would tackle these kind of interrelated problems that need the harmonization of data, knowledge and expertise from all sorts of different domains. If anyone's interested in that, after sort of talking about it right through the pandemic, two colleagues of mine at the Turing, Ben MacArthur, the mathematical biologist, Cosmina Bantu, my co-director who's an economist, and myself, wrote a little paper about that called Resilience Government Requires Data Science Reform, trying to encourage that kind of way about thinking about data modeling. And of course, large language models here can be a real help in taking you some of the way towards developing some of those kind of models, and then you can build on them. The second point I wanted to make about AI and work in the public sector is this question of sort of how you automate. There have been huge hopes for productivity gains from successive generations of technology in the public sector, just as there have been in the private sector. Depressingly, after all the digital transformation initiatives and policies across government that I have worked on, ONS data has highlighted that total public service productivity grew by an average of 0.2% during 1997 and 2019. Not that exciting, with several public service areas being completely static or actually diminishing growth. And there are surely some wins here to come from large language models. If we can think about it, improving the quality of what public services or public service professionals do, rather than thinking about automating them. Take doctors, for example, who famously spend a large proportion of their time on paperwork, up to 70% by some estimates, but I think that needs interrogation. I think it might have been invented by Jeremy Hunt. And LLMs are very well suited to tackle those very routine tasks, not because we want to replace the doctors, but because we want them to spend more time being doctors and good doctors. And they've never been shown to be sort of brilliant at paperwork, is also a point worth noting. So that's a key area. But is that what's actually happening? Well, we are doing some work on that with the Cabinet Office, but I should point out that there are some warning signals here about how this is actually going in the real world. We recently did a survey of how 1,000 public service professionals within the UK, covering education, health, social work, and emergency services, were actually using generative AI in terms of a large language model. What we found was a really widespread use compared with any other sort of AI. This kind of bottom-up use by public service professionals. 22% actively using a generative AI system, and 45% kind of aware that people in their area were using it and thinking about using it. These numbers are really high if you think about it for AI. This includes social workers, emergency service workers, and so on. And other things we found was that they were very positive about their use of the technology and its potential to enhance the public sector. They thought that they should use more of it, that they would use more of it in the future. They had astonishing levels of trust in it, like sort of 61%, which I personally found deeply worrying. And they had a very low fear of their jobs being replaced. They weren't worried about their jobs being replaced. They thought that it was helping them to do a better job. They thought the UK was missing out on opportunities to use it, in vast majority. But only a minority of those respondents actually thought, about a quarter, actually thought that they were having any clear guidance on how to use these technologies. So the kind of lesson there is the UK's public sector urgently needs to develop more systematic methods for taking advantage of this technology. There are lots of possibilities there, but without guidance, I find that rather terrifying. And just to finish, my third point about the public sector is this question of information, which is an area that I and my team work on extensively. There's a concept in political science called nodality, It was actually developed by Christopher Hood from All Souls, and he and I wrote a book together many years ago now called The Tools of Government in the Digital Age. And nodality is a key tool of government. It's the capacity to exchange information, to disseminate information, and to receive information from the outside world. Now, nodality used to be something that governments had by virtue of being government. It was kind of assumed they had a monopoly on these things. If you needed to find something out, you went to a public organisation like a local council or a library, and government knew all about you. They were like a watchtower or a watermill at the centre of society and the economy. But as Chris has pointed out, well, both of you have pointed out, that is absolutely no longer the case. Governments hold far, far less about citizens than Google or any number, or well, no, a small number, sorry, of other big technology firms. Massively smaller amounts of information, and kind of increasingly smaller, and there's all sorts of data that is needed to use AI in a pro-human way that they can't get hold of. The other question is how they get information out to citizens because of losing this monopoly. Now, certainly in the early days of social media, it was so much easier for any citizen to get their kind of 15 minutes of fame. It's much easier for citizens to reach each other and potentially, occasionally, reach really large numbers of people, although, of course, that's quite rare. Of course, all sorts of other actors can use it too, including criminals, and they have proved very proficient at that. So most of the kind of misinformation and disinformation trends that we are familiar with from social media are going to be turbocharged by large language models, and we are working with the UK Safety Institute, a recently formed Safety Institute, on that issue. Now, I do believe there are contexts where we are going to end up in the situation Hannah Arendt was so presciently suggesting. That's not to say we won't believe anything about anything. We will always have to believe something about something. But there's certain contexts where it could get to the point, you could argue it has already got to the point, that people are starting not to believe anything. And I'm going to take the example, and that particularly applies to the public sector, all sorts of the public sector. I think it's really difficult for the public sector now to get information out. Let's take the examples to end with elections, because we all voted today. Well, if you're a political scientist, you have to vote, or be like a vegetarian saying they ate sausages. And, you know, how were people getting information about where to vote, what day the election was, what the rules were, the new photo ID rules, never mind what they think about the candidates, the parties, whether they believe anything about them, and trust in those professions is really, really low. And I do think we are headed to a place, particularly in the US, where we know that whatever the result of the election, there will be a real question whether people believe the result. So for democracy, as Darren said, this is really very worrying. And I think what we've got to prioritise is how to get good information out to people. There's a huge focus on misinformation at the moment. I mean, I've just made one, I guess. And there's the focus on existential risk from later developments in AI that comes from Silicon Valley has sort of reinforced that focus on misinformation by exaggerating potentially risks that may not be. It's made people even more worried about any information they see. And ironically enough, the things that are given to us by big tech companies to help us, like Microsoft's Copilot, put a warning on every piece of information, even good information. So you can see that there is a danger that this situation is going to get worse, and we've been exploring some of those scenarios with the Safety Institute. But kind of building on government nodality and thinking about how government can get its nodality back, that capacity to give out and receive information, I think will be really important. So, as I mentioned, there is a lot to be worried about, but there's also lots of things to be positive about. I mean, the possibilities for an improved public sector, better decision making, better public services, increasing well-being. There is a lot to be positive about, but it's also the case that things like large language models have been released by companies almost without warning. They've been released into society. They've been developed with very distinct incentives, some of which relate to the kind of pursuit to be the first in the artificial general intelligence race. And we, as societies and governments, have got to learn to live with them. And that is going to be a really important task. I think we should, of course, research the threats for misinformation. We should research existential risk and the possibilities of that. But because Darren started with a photograph of Alan Turing, I'm going to end with a quote. Most quotes by Alan Turing are completely fake because, you know, he didn't write, he didn't talk, give public talks very often, and he mostly wrote maths. It's not very quotable. But this one, I promise, is absolutely verified. And he said, we can only see a short distance ahead, but we can see plenty there that needs to be done. Thank you.
Helen, thank you very much indeed. Now, theoretically, time is up, but I'm going to ask the Dean if we can have 10 more minutes, something like that. What I suggest is that in just a moment, Darren has a minute or so to respond very succinctly to what we've heard. While he's speaking, if those in charge of microphones could get them in the hands of people who look as though they're going to ask very short questions, we'll then, so all power now lies with the microphone people, we'll then sweep around the room and maybe get, I don't know, half a dozen comments, questions, and let's try and give every part of the room a go, and then all three of you can have a go at that. So please dish out microphones while Darren responds.
Well, first of all, I've had amazing hospitality from the Lall family, from Oxford, from the Said Business School, from you, John, and now I have amazing hospitality from my discussants who are very gentle and nice to me, so thank you. So I just want to pick up on one thing that each one of them said, just to amplify it, because there's no disagreement. So Chris mentioned the Friedman doctrine. In fact, I have done some work on that, and what we find in a paper using Danish and US data is that managers with business school degrees, since we're in a business school, don't improve investment, productivity, export, but they cut wages. And they do so citing a lot of Friedman value, cost leanness, et cetera, incentives. And I think this is very much related to exactly what Chris was saying. Of course, there is a huge amount of useful information that managers are learning. But when it comes to very important decisions, I think the values matter a lot. And those values also intersect with exactly what Helen was mentioning, which is, you know, if you think of labor as a cost, then the main thing you want to do is cut it. If you think of labor as your most important human resource, then you start thinking, oh, well, can I actually increase that productivity? So that's, I think, is many managers actually learn that in business schools, but they're not practicing it enough. And I think that's part of essentially getting out of this conundrum. And there is a nuts and bolts problem here. And the nuts and bolts problem is, if you're a manager, you need the tools to complement your workers. But you also need to have that attitude. So if the tech industry is not providing the tools, you have the nuts, not the bolts. But if you don't have the attitude, you have the bolts, but not the nuts. So both of them need to change at the same time. And I think that's why it's a social change problem, rather than just an individual manager. But I think individual managers can do a lot as well. Thank you.
Great. So let's sweep around the room this way, people with microphones. And please do keep comments, questions super short. We'll gather a basket of them and then
Okay.
panelists can pick and choose. Yes.
Very quick question. Thanks for the presentation. So as you highlighted, at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, labor movements negotiated with capital, and they made they got some concessions in the form of the welfare state. So how do you think labor in the 21st century will negotiate with technology, and what kind of order would emerge out of that negotiation?
Great question, thank you. Next.
Yeah. How complete is a conversation about the future of work in the age of AI without explicitly talking about race, gender, and similar issues, especially considering that large gender and racial biases have been found in AI systems sold by Amazon and other companies? So yeah, basically how complete is this conversation if we're not talking about the issues they can exacerbate?
Thank you. Another terrific question. Let's take a couple more and then give you a chance to respond. Then we might do another round subsequently. Who's got a mic?
Hello. I'm Raphael Dali, and I'm studying computer science and philosophy, so I'm definitely interested in all of these things. There's been some movement on this with things like the AI Safety Summit with Matt Clifford, who's around, and he's done some talks as well here. But I was wondering, do you think that AI will force government to take more of a stance, given the issues that you've outlined, and actually have more influence over these, sort of against what we've seen over the last 40 years, basically, of it receding?
Thank you. Let's do one more and then to the panel.
Thank you. Two quick questions. Why do you worry so much about China? And secondly, is there any scope for international cooperation in your matrix of policy choices that you talk about?
Great, thank you. So if microphones can be reallocated while Darren first, any of those points you want to pick up.
Okay,
please
all
go.
excellent points. So I think, and Chris also mentioned it with the sort of stakeholder capitalism, or what early institutional economists in the US used to call welfare capitalism. I think negotiations with labor are very important. Actually, but the negotiations with labor is important for two other reasons that are very important. I didn't have time to get into it. One is, if you're going to use technology for a pro-worker way, or a little bit pro-worker way, how could you do that without having worker voice? So it's like you're excluding the people who actually know how they're using existing technologies, what the difficulties they have. So I think worker voice is very important, and essentially the only method we know so far is through some sort of organized labor. There might be new ways, may come out in the 21st century, but worker voice is critical. But second, also labor unions need to change. If all labor unions do is ask for higher wages, that will just fuel automation. But labor unions negotiating over how to use technology. In fact, they have done that in Scandinavia. They have done it in the US in some rare occasions, so that you actually encourage firms to adopt new tasks and provide more training, more technical work, while you're also automating. In Germany, I think work councils do that to some degree. I think that's a very, very important thing. In terms of gender and race, let me just say on gender, if you look at pre-AI automation, the big burden was on men. If you look at the current generative AI capabilities and what can be automated, it's a lot more for women. Actually, more for white women actually than minorities. So you actually see white women in the United States bearing the biggest burden. So obviously these are very important, but it's a holistic approach. It's not one group versus another. I think the whole labor group needs to change. And on China, look, I think China has shown how AI can be regulated, except that they are regulating it in a very draconian way with completely the wrong objectives. And the Chinese Communist Party shows exactly how you can use AI to control people. So I think, whatever your views on China may have been before AI, I think they should have become more negative after AI. And I think Chinese technology spreading around the world is also a big problem. But on the other hand, I think global cooperation is a must, because AI is a global technology, as is international trade, pandemics, and so on and so forth. And I think there are many dimensions in which US and China can coexist and can partially cooperate. They're never going to cooperate on surveillance because I think there is sufficient disagreement, but there are many other dimensions in which they can, and we may need some leadership. European Commission is playing some leadership, imperfect though it may be, and there may be other ways of sort of cooperating, and I think pro-worker AI that's actually at the end productive would be adopted by a lot of countries. So I think there is room for cooperation.
Thank you. Chris, Helen, any points to add?
Just actually on gender and race that was pointed out there, we're very active in that in London. In fact, Joy and I have been, I'm the current one, Joy is a former president of the Royal Economic Society. We have a special committee, Women's Committee. I'm the only male member of the Women's Committee for the Royal Economic Society, actually. And I'm in the process of organizing, if you're interested, in the process of organizing a big event in London. It would probably be in the autumn, which is precisely addressing the issue of AI and gender, mainly, so what impact it has. I mean, it's a question of time. AI is a big topic. Today was more about the aggregate economy and what's happening there. At the aggregate, it doesn't mean that we're never talking about what goes on behind, and it's absolutely essential that we eliminate, in fact, discrimination and other sort of biased outcomes in the labor market, and we're actively working on that.
I'll just make one point. I mean, obviously, those are massive issues and really important issues. I'll quite agree. At one point, I sort of guilt-tripped the Turing Institute in spending quite a bit of money and setting up a research team on this, particularly on the issue of women in data science. The figures are absolutely appalling in terms of actually producing this technology. 8% of presenters at leading machine learning conferences are women. And the figures for what percentage of venture capital goes to women or women-founded firms is utterly appalling. And although I know that most of the bias and a lot of the issues come from data, I do think this overwhelming sort of homogeneity of the people who develop this stuff is also problematic. And as my colleague, the sociologist Judy Wiseman, who leads this research, always says, we have to make the developers understand that biased tech is bad tech, and it won't be good tech until it isn't biased.
Thank you. Now look, let's take 3 more quick-fire questions, quick-fire answers, and then wrap. Who has a microphone and such a question?
Mohammed Al-Sabah, what would be an example of tax policy to remove capital favoring asymmetries?
Thank you.
Can I?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yep.
All of you seem to be agreeing that some kind of a regulatory mechanism is necessary to neutralize the possible harmful consequences of AI. But to what extent one can trust that regulatory mechanism will be free from the power of those who hold power?
Very good question. And let's take last one and then back to the panel.
This talk has talked a lot about kind of quite big organizations, public policy, large organizations, etc. In a lot of his interviews, Sam Altman says, we've got a bet on what will be the first single human unicorn. What do you think are the implications of AI on entrepreneurship and the implications that has for both people and productivity?
Great. Daron.
Another wonderful set of questions. Since it's very quick, I'll respond just to the first 2. I think thanks for bringing up that issue. That's one of my bugbears. If you look in the US, and the situation is not that different in the UK, a little bit less extreme. Right now, if you buy a machine, you pay less than 5% tax. If you hire a worker jointly with the worker, you pay over 30% tax. So this is partly because of political lobbying, partly thanks to economists who, for strange reasons that don't have great theoretical justification, have argued for zero capital taxation. And it creates a big incentive for firms to use machines rather than labor. And if you equate that, it's not a panacea, but it would be very useful. Yes, absolutely, regulation will be captured. regulation will not be perfect, it will be misused, but it's better than no regulation. And I think we have a lot of historical evidence on how you can build better regulatory institutions, how you learn by doing the regulation. So we have no other choice but try. Thank you.
Chris.
No, I agree entirely. I also agree about taxes, actually, with the justification, of course, just to add is that capital is mobile, whereas labor isn't. And if you tax capital, it's going to go and be located in the Cayman Islands or something, which they are. Which there is some basis there if you see but so the answer to that is that we should try and stop those tiny places, most of which are British protectorates, actually, offering this low tax. On regulation, I think it's absolutely essential that we regulate it because it can be abused. It's I had an interesting conversation once about that, talking of China with Justin Lin. I don't know if you know the former head of chief economist of the World Bank, and he kind of agreed entirely. But he said there is a trade-off when it comes to regulating these things like AI, that you could over-regulate and make sure that not much is happening, but then you could regulate a lot and stop abuse, which he used as the China case, or you could regulate much less and then be subject to all these crimes like cybercrime and other kinds of crime if you don't have enough surveillance, which he said is the US. And he said it's a matter of societal choices. And I tend to agree actually with his evaluation about that. On AI and entrepreneurship, it's just like any other new knowledge that comes along, and the entrepreneurs that pick up that knowledge first and find some useful application are the ones who will succeed. But I hope they don't follow the Friedman doctrine in what they call the success, following Stiglitz doctrines.
Great. Final word, Helen.
I'll just do the one on regulation. Yeah, I mean, one hopeful thing I totally agree with Darren. I mean, one hopeful thing I could say is that at least everyone now is talking about regulation, and they're talking about global regulation. They're talking about regulation at all levels, with my unerring ability to be interested in something that most people aren't interested in. Been looking at regulation for quite a long time, but really see that it's been talked about much more now. But I would say two things. One is that it can't only be regulation. We've got an Online Safety Act passed in this country now. I and people in my team have been talking, and the community more generally have been talking about that for 7 years before that became law. You can't just do it with, the technology has changed hugely during that period. You can't just do it with regulation. You need public awareness, you need education, you need things like user controls, for example, which are a major part of the Online Safety Act. Only nobody knows whether anybody uses them. You need research on that kind of thing. And you need collaboration with the companies as well if you want to get the data. And on the capture point, well, normally when I give a talk on this subject, I was at the AI Summit, not on the second day though, because the second day was too important for academics. And the last picture of the summit on the second day, there were more leaders, Silicon Valley leaders, than there were political leaders, and that tells you all you need to know, really.
Huge thanks all, and the Dean will conclude the occasion.
Well, I promised you an intellectual treat, and I think we delivered, right? Let's thank the panel, and especially the speakers, for an excellent... A very big thank you to you all also for giving us your time. We know your time is precious, so thank you very much. A big thank you to Rani, Sanjaya Lall Foundation also. And of course, Rani reminding me, as she always does, that there's a wonderful little physical treat for your reception outside, so please join us in the drinks and carry the conversation on with the distinguished panelists. Thank you.